Today on The Nation Speaks, big news this week from Twitter. Founder and CEO Jack Dorsey stepping down, and a new privacy policy unveiled. What does it foretell about the social media platform? That's what we ask former Parler CEO John Matze. Then in America Q&A, if COVID never goes away, what about masks, social distancing, vaccine mandates? Which policies do you think should stay or go? Black Lives Matter launching its Christmas campaign against so-called white supremacist capitalism. It wants you to boycott white companies, most of which support BLM. We hear what former Cincinnati Mayor Ken Blackwell has to say about it. And in our second America Q&A, we ask, if you could change one thing to improve your quality of life, what would it be? Twitter broke Twitter this week with several big announcements. Founder and CEO Jack Dorsey stepped down without warning after 16 years. His replacement is Chief Technical Officer Parag Agrawal, who's been with the company since 2011. Agrawal hadn't been very much in the public eye, but now everyone is examining the tea leaves to see what it will mean for the popular platform going forward. Perhaps significantly, the first day under his new leadership, Twitter rolled out a policy change related to privacy that's causing a Twitter storm of complaint, mostly because users imagine how it could be abused. Here to discuss all of this is John Matze, founder and former CEO of Parler, a social media platform set up as a free speech version of Twitter. John, welcome.
Thank you, Cindy.
So first of all, I'd like to hear your reaction to Jack Dorsey leaving the company that he co-founded after 16 years.
Well, it's not exactly surprising, to me at least, right? Because they've had a lot of kind of back and forth with leadership. And I kind of like to look at their stock price and kind of their performance history. And if you look at that and you let the marketplace judge his performance over the last 6 or so years, you'll see that it's been pretty flat. In 6 years, investors get like a 4% return on investment. It's a horrible proposition. And so you combine that with a complete lack of innovation in a space which is developing and changing so much every day. There's so much opportunity in the news space, and they just haven't accomplished much of anything. And so this isn't surprising to me that he's no longer CEO.
I think the big question on most people's minds is, what does all this mean for the company going forward and with the new CEO? So some people are saying that Dorsey, was the last holdout with respect to free speech inside a company that's filled with a lot of progressives. Having said that, conservatives have been complaining for years about being shadow banned or outright banned by Twitter, including sitting president Donald Trump. It's noteworthy that this new media privacy policy was rolled out the day after Dorsey stepped down, and we'll look at that afterwards. But what I want to look at first is the new CEO and what we might expect from him going forward. So in an interview with MIT Technology Review just about a year ago, in answer to a question about how to balance trying to combat misinformation and protected speech, Agrawal said this.
Our role is not to be bound by the First Amendment, but our role is to serve a healthy public conversation. And our moves are reflective of things that we believe lead to a healthier public conversation. The kinds of things that we do to what about this is to focus less on thinking about free speech, but thinking about how the times have changed.
And the next part people haven't been quoting as much, but I think it's very important. He says,
our role is particularly emphasized is who can be heard. And so increasingly our role is moving towards how we recommend content. And that sort of is the struggle that we're working through in terms of how we make sure these recommendation systems that we're building and how we direct people's attention is leading to a healthy public conversation that is most participatory.
So it's clear that free speech is not the priority, but the priority is elevating some speech, which of course necessarily means suppressing other speech. So as someone who sought to essentially build a free speech focused version of Twitter, how do you interpret what Agrawal said there?
Well, I see this as more of the same for Twitter. If anything, it'll probably get a little bit more restrictive. But, from their perspective, right, they want to shape a community, which is in line with, I guess, their vision of where they think society is heading, and their new policies and statements that they make are completely in line with that. Which means, you can expect things like taking sides in certain political and or societal discussions, which is kind of what they've already had a history of doing. If you go back and look at the Hunter Biden story with the New York Post and how before the election, the last presidential election, they decided to kind of censor that story. That was causing, in their mind, I guess, harm because it could hurt a political candidate who I think that they liked. And so, you'll see things like that happening more in the future. I don't know that this is a large change. I think that, it just seems from my perspective, right, I have obviously no inside knowledge within Twitter, but I would say that this just seems like more of the same to me. You're going to see more restrictions on speech, and you're going to see more or less a same kind of lack of performance by a company that's been stagnating for 6 years or so. And I'm not trying to be offensive to them or say anything mean about them particularly. I'm just trying to be realistic, right? This is what we're going to see.
So let me bring up something else that he mentioned in the interview, and it's about misinformation. I think the assumption is always that these platforms are actually trying to identify, what might be misinformation, and although they may do it in a sloppy way or in a too fast way, that the intention is there. But something else he said in that interview is striking.
Our approach to it isn't to try to identify or flag all potential misinformation. But our approach is rooted in trying to avoid specific harm that misleading information can cause. Defining misinformation is really, really hard. As we learn through time, our understanding of truth also evolves. We attempt to not adjudicate truth. We focus on potential for harm.
Well, I view this as a lot of virtue signaling and key buzzwords, right? It makes people feel good listening to that statement if you don't want people to get hurt and you want to make sure they're doing the, quote unquote right thing. But it's really not based in reality, because how do you define harm? Well, they have a different definition than maybe most of society. That's why you see their policies and statements like this not rooted in law or not rooted in kind of free speech principles. You see them rooted in feelings and emotions and non-tangibles that can fluctuate based off of their interpretation of society at any given moment. And so it's really a meaningless statement that's meant to make people feel good, but, you can't define misinformation. And I think the COVID era has been complete evidence of the inability to define it, because every week, what is or is not misinformation, what science knows and doesn't know, it seems to fluctuate so much because everything is so new. And you could argue there's a lot of harm that could be, occurred if the wrong, judgments are passed around society during this time. But how do you know? So, like I said, this is more just vague, business as usual for Twitter, feel good statements that are essentially meaningless and give them pretty, broad authority to act at their discretion on the platform.
Be sure to watch the entire episode, now available exclusively at EpochTV.com, a new completely censorship-free premium subscription platform brought to you by the Epoch Times. See you there.